And we are recording. Stephan, welcome to the Honey Badger Diaries.
Thanks for having me, Aaron. It's a pleasure to speak with you, as always.
Yeah, we've had contact over like Twitter DMs and these kind of things. Sometimes you're sort of my unofficial Austrian Economics helpline here and there.
That's right. I do recall you asked me, you were pinging me with a few questions here and there about, some of the different debates within Austrian economics, like fractional reserve banking and full reserve and so on.
That's right. Yeah, I got into Austrian economics a short while ago, like a year ago or something, because I'm writing a book. It's kind of on hold now because all the craziness, and I want to pay attention to that and do the podcast. But I'm writing a book on the history of Bitcoin, so I wanted to have a lot of Austrian economics. So I got into it, and it just really blew my mind in a way. It's really interesting, and it's such a better way to look at the whole economic discipline, in my opinion, compared
to. Yeah, I'd love to hear that. Yeah.
But I usually start my podcast with let's start with the coronavirus stuff and what's been going on in Australia. What has been going on?
Sure.
You're in Sydney, so what's the situation like over there and in the rest of Australia?
Right. So the world, obviously, there are different levels of lockdown, right? You got some countries like, Belarus and Sweden who are relatively lax. Over here in Australia, I would say we're not the craziest, most strict, right? Because here in Australia, they're thinking, now, yes, we are locked down. And it's in some ways becoming a police state and surveillance state, which obviously as a libertarian, I'm very concerned about.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of the general rule set that we're operating under right now, it's kind of like everyone work from home if you can. If you must go into work, do so. But certain things have all been shut down, right? All sports have been shut down. All restaurants, bars, nightclubs, casinos, gyms, all of that has been shut down. And then from an authoritarian perspective, you're also not allowed to be outside of your house unless it's for a reasonable excuse or whatever. And they've listed out a bunch. But generally, it's things like buying groceries, pharmacy, health appointments. You're allowed to, I think, exercise, but you're not allowed to do it in big groups and things. And it's kind of like there's all these, bureaucracy and rules as typically they do, right?
And is there police going around checking on that?
Yeah, so there've been a few stories here in Australia. There was one guy who got busted for literally buying a kebab and eating it on a park bench. So, like, restaurants theoretically are allowed to open, but only for takeaway. Right?
On his own? He was eating it on his own?
Yeah, right. So he was on his own, and it's just stupid stuff like that. Or there was this girl. I think she was 17. She's a learner, right, learning to drive, and her mum, right. So obviously they live together, and her mum took her out for a drive to get some hours, to accumulate hours to go for the driving test. And they got busted because that was apparently not a reasonable excuse. And again, they're inside their car. They're not spreading the germs anywhere. They're not spreading the coronavirus, right? And so it's introducing this whole vector of bureaucracy and police discretion, because now the police are the ones who decide whether you're allowed to be outside your own house. So it's been just completely BS from that point of view, right? Now, from a cases and deaths point of view and so on, we are, last I checked, something like a little over 6,000 that is confirmed coronavirus cases. We've had something like 60 something deaths of coronavirus, and we've got maybe 80 people in the ICU. So for all the claims about, oh my God, the hospitals are going to be overwhelmed and whatever. Now, again, part of the argument is, oh, okay, but the lockdowns helped stop the overflow of the hospitals and so on. So I guess that's obviously part of that whole debate. But
hang on, you also said there were how many confirmed cases and how many hospitalizations based on that?
Oh, so don't forget that some of those have already healed up, right? So so it's 6,000 who had coronavirus confirmed on a test at all, but then of that, probably 3,000 or so have already recovered from it.
Sure.
And then of the people who still have it, it's something like 80 people who are still in an ICU, right? And as usual, the statistics, again, not like trivializing people's lives and stuff, but obviously the people who've died have tended to be much, much, much older. And so that's an interesting, and it's an ethical question as well around how much liberty should a person who's in their 20s and 30s and 40s who's healthy be giving up for like when really the efforts, in my view, should have been targeted towards actually high risk people, not just blanket ban of everyone, you know.
No,
But again,
I just
that's where this whole debate comes in. But you're gone.
sure. No, I just thought you said 60,000 instead of 6,000, so that would have been a very unusual statistic if there's only so few serious cases. But that was
Right.
just
Yeah.
me
Yeah.
mishearing you.
Yeah. 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 And I mean, for
As
context, the Australian population is about 25 million, right? So that's kind of what we're working with. But in fairness, it's an island, so you know, it's kind of you know, but also tourism is a big part of the Australian economy, and so now there's a lot of people struggling, right? There's a lot of people. I know stories of people who've like lost their job, lost their house, lost their business, they've lost their livelihood, they've had life savings, and it's a complete mess, right? And as I'm sure you're, you know, all around the world there are similar stories on this, and that's why it's such a difficult thing to talk about, because as soon as you mention it, it's like, oh my God, you want grandma to die kind of thing. And it's like, well, no, hold on. Like there's more to it than that, right? Because the typical person, they're thinking, oh, like, so like the socialist straw man is something like, oh, see, you just care about another 0.3% of GDP and your stupid stock market. I care about human lives kind of thing. And that's completely that's like a complete straw man, like massive straw man, right? Because the way I'm viewing it, and the way most like people who are saying, well, hang on, let's also consider the economy, right? We're not saying the virus is not real, right? I think it's real, but we have to also consider the economic impact, right? And so the way I would think of it is more like when someone tells me that kind of thing of like, oh, I care about health, but not the economy and stuff like that. I think that's basically, it's like someone saying, I care about plants, but I don't care about soil and water and sunlight. It's like, no, you don't understand. Like everything is more connected than you realize. And
Mhm.
so you can't just say, oh, I care only about the health, and we should just say, screw everything else, screw the economy. It's like, no, hold on. The harder you lock down, the longer you lock down, the more you regulate, the more we will see eventual shortages in things. You know, how do you think the food gets made? And how do you think the medical supplies get made? Right? And not just that, it's that all these things are interconnected. So it might be all well and good for the government to say, yeah, we're going to say this is a non-essential business and that's an essential business. So we're going to keep the mask supply coming and the medical supply and the toilet paper and whatever else. But the reality of it is everything is interconnected. And so they might say, yeah, we want the mask factory to stay open, but that mask factory might need some obscure part from some equipment thing that got shut down because they got forcefully shut down, right? Or the hospital might need air conditioning, and then the air conditioners can't get repaired because X, Y, and Z part is not available because, again, all the forceful shutdowns. And that is the approach that I've been taking to this as well. And also trying to
Well,
communicate this
I'll tell you,
concept around commensurate response. But go on. Yep.
I'll take the opposite argument there. I think something like a bar is definitely not essential. There's no bar that can close that will starve people. That's like just luxury, right?
Even there, I think there are, I would say it's like there are connections that we don't realize. So a quick example might be, let's say Amazon. Amazon are requiring on certain fixed costs to make the business model work. And it could be that maybe some, you know, supplier of something is like depending on some of the business that comes from that bar, or like that, you know, it's like depending on the income from like the person who earns money at that bar to be spending it somewhere else. Like that's the whole point I'm trying to make, is that everything is just so connected that it's these systems are so much more complex than any one person or any individual can even conceive. And that to me is why. Now, I can appreciate maybe you could sort of hear an argument of like, maybe early on we didn't really know what was going on with the data, maybe like a short-term thing, maybe I could see an argument there. I think for me, or maybe I could have seen, really, I think I could have seen more of an argument around quarantine the high-risk people, right? Like if you're old or if you're sick, you are the one who has to be quarantined, and the young and healthy people should be out and about, because, or at least not necessarily all out and about. I I think it should be more like treat people like an adult, right? Like give them the information and let them make an informed decision, and say, hey, like we recommend you wear a mask and you wash your hands and you whatever. And I think that would have been a far more sustainable approach as well. That's
I
not
totally agree with that.
risking, social unrest,
I totally
because
agree with
like,
that, and
yeah,
I think it's also a great point about that the economy is even more interconnected than I assumed with my bar example. That's a very good point. Now, is one of the reasons that the whole economy is so fragile. This gets back to the Austrian economics point. Like, wouldn't the whole economic system be a lot less fragile if there was a monetary system where people are incentivized to save, where they can,
what
you know, keep going for a couple of months, even with lower income, instead of uh, everyone basically being in debt and needing to move forward perpetually?
100%, 100%. And it has made not only individuals more fragile, it's made the businesses more fragile as well. So fundamentally, a lot of people just do not have savings because they don't have an incentive to. They got punished for having savings, right? If you hold a cash balance, if you hold savings, you're losing value over time, right? You're getting paid some terribly low interest rate that's nowhere near the level of what CPI, consumer price inflation, is. And people, this is a factor that Guido Hulsmann mentions as well. He talks about the leverage factor, right? Because when credit is so cheap, it just becomes such a strong incentive for people to all go into debt, because you are benefiting from there being inflation. And so if you are living in a fiat inflationary world, the incentive is for people to, when they start their career, to go into debt and get a mortgage and buy a house and whatever, because over time they'll get promotions, and over time the real purchasing power, like, that they're paying back on that loan, is dramatically dropping over time. And so if you kind of expand it out over kind of a person's lifetime and how they're thinking about planning things, that really changes how they think about these things. And so you've got this weird scenario where you get this kind of effect of people out competing each other for different resources and whatever. And it's easier for the person who has got the cheap fiat credit to outcompete the person who's trying to just save up in, just in the kind of quote unquote responsible way,
Yep.
because you're kind of operating at a disadvantage. And so that's a big factor there. And then just the
And I think
fact,
we're seeing this on every level. We're seeing this on the individual level, where individuals are incentivized to go into debt with mortgages and all of that. We're seeing that on company levels, where companies are going into debt, even buying back their own stocks to push up the price, that sort of nonsense. And we're seeing it on a country level, where states are just going into debt. So it's the
absolutely. And
whole...
one of the, yeah,
Go on.
absolutely. And the government is one of the biggest beneficiaries of this inflationary system. And that's basically been the case in history. The government was always one of the biggest beneficiaries of inflation. They benefit from either going Zimbabwe style, like just straight up printing it, or in the more subtle sense, they benefit from having a quote unquote liquid market in which to sell their bonds. How do they fund their efforts? They make some bonds, and then they issue those, and then they repay them. And basically they just kick the can. And so this becomes the vehicle by which a politician can promise lots and lots of free things now while pushing the cost onto future generations. And so this is one of those points where Austrians and others will disagree and say, well, hang on, like someone like Krugman will say, no, we owe it to ourselves. And then the Austrians will be like, no, hold on, that's actually not correct. You actually are pushing the cost to future generations, and you are living beyond your own means.
I saw what's his name? He's a pretty prominent Austrian economist now. Murphy.
Oh, Bob Murphy. Yeah, I'm a huge fan of Bob Murphy.
Yeah, Bob Murphy. He had a good presentation about this. How does this actually sort of plays out over time if you borrow from the future, and that it does skew. So in a way, it's true that the debts are owed to ourselves, but it's not that everyone benefits equally. There's still a lot of skewing going on with the borrowing and the
Exactly.
debt.
So one of the insights he points out is that it's not like this generation is all alive at once and then this generation all dies and it's the next one. There's actually interlocking. And that was the key insight that he points out. It's actually that some generations are alive while others are,
Yes,
there's a
exactly. Yes, that's the one. So how did we get here, Stefan? We're now in a situation where there there appears to be an economic crisis developing, and I want to take a step back with you and like how did we get to this point over the past decades? Because I think we've been stumbling from crisis to crisis. That's what's been happening, right?
no political leader wanted to pay the cost of being responsible. Or if they did, their own party would have kicked them out and said, well, whoa, there's no way we're going to get elected on this platform. Get rid of this guy. We'll get the other guy in. And so because of that competitive dynamic within the party that kind of selects in a bad way, if you will.
Very short
And
term way of thinking.
yeah, exactly. And because of the competitive political pressure to promise free things and to not say unpopular things and make unpopular decisions, that, in my view, is why we've ended up where we are now. And that's why we end up now, it's kind of this end point, the end game of, so we've gone from things like Trump trying to directly tell the Fed to print more and to lower the interest rates because he wants, quote unquote, America to be more competitive, right? Because again, in his mind, he's not getting that, just because you've got more money doesn't mean you've got more productivity or more stuff, right? And so we're kind of moving to an MMT, modern monetary theory endgame, right? Because people are starting to come along with that rhetoric of, well, hey, why don't you just print more of it? And there are obviously the more cooler heads in the room who are saying, well, hold on, MMT is not a good thing. And then obviously you've got some of us from the kind of Bitcoiner accelerationist camp who are saying, yeah, why not? Just,
Yeah,
we can't stop you. So we can't stop you. So go for it. Go on MMT away. I've got my Bitcoins and, I mean, obviously it's a bit crass and it's not the ideal way that we would have liked this to go. We would have liked there to be a more orderly kind of transition, but unfortunately, that's just not the way the world works. People have to, as my friend Matt Odell would say, they've got to touch the stove before they've got to get burnt before they actually learn. And so
yeah.
for most people, they're going to have to touch the stove. They're going to have to feel the inflationary hit in their hip pocket, in their wallet, and then they'll start to think about, oh, whoa, actually, what's this Bitcoin thing? How do I get into that? I think that's the way this is unfortunately going to have to go. As much as you and I might like it to be a bit more, intellectually driven, I don't think it will be.
Yeah, for those who don't know MMT, I'll try to summarize it in one sentence, and then you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think the idea is that the government prints money for its expenses, so it doesn't even borrow anymore, just prints it, and then on the counter part of that, it does take money for taxes, which it basically destroys at that point. So it's a bit different from how it works now.
Right. No, I think you've basically summarized it. I think the thing is, though, like if the MMT proponents, they seem a little bit slippery in the way they sort of present it. They try to sort of say, oh, look, it's all just a tautology and we all just owe each other and whatever. They are sort of glossing over the reality that you can't just print prosperity, right? And so then, but then if you try to nail them on that point, then they'll sort of go around and say, oh, no, but see, it's just a tautology. Like, what do you mean? And then it's like, yeah, so you sort of, I don't know. I found I sort of go around in circles on that. But like I said, there's not much we can do to convince some of these people that MMT is a bad idea. So at this point, the Bitcoiner accelerationist in me is saying, let's go for it.
Well, why is it a bad idea exactly? So I would say the reason I think it's a bad idea is it benefits whoever is printing the money, right? The Cantillon effects.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's yeah. Well, I think in that case, yeah, it would benefit whoever's printing the money first, absolutely. But it's just, I mean, the main thing is just that you can't print your way to prosperity, right? Like you can't just get more productive. So the way I think of it is more like you've got almost the society's stock of capital and its skills and whatever, and that's whatever this level is. But then you've got this amount of money, right? And then just because you're printing more has that changed our real ability to produce anything? No, it hasn't. And so now some of the different arguments go about like, needing inflation, whatever. Like one of the Keynesian arguments is like the whole, sticky wages argument and so on, that people wouldn't, understand, or they would need some kind of way to feel like they're winning in it. And that's why you need a low and stable inflation, or some of the different arguments around things like, oh, okay, there's going to be an output gap and the government has to try and step in. And again, a lot of these ideas are just, they are bunk if you really properly assess them.
Well,
But it just kind of takes some work.
if you boil it down, it's really more about psychology. Like it's a psychology idea that what you mentioned, like sticky wages, and that's what it is. It's an assumption on human psychology more than logic or anything like that, right?
Yeah, that's right. And so also, actually, funnily enough, referring back to Bob Murphy, he has a great article on this as well, because what he points out is that actually, rather than the kind of sticky or unsticky, everyone has a certain level on which they would prefer their wages to be. And so it's actually more like, it's kind of like a spectrum, and actually it's more like people pick it based on, okay, that's because because we're in this inflationary environment, there might be times, maybe I'm not explaining this well, but it's like there might be times where it makes sense for you to not necessarily be so like rigid about how much of your wage you're taking now, because remember, the entrepreneurs are taking risk as well, so that's like a very underappreciated factor in this as well. And the other factor is that they are doing the time shifting, right? So if let's say I work for you, you're my employer, you're paying me regardless of whether you make money, whether your business is making money. And we might be doing a production process that takes 1 year, but you're still paying me now. You're only going to get paid in a year. And so there's that time shifting nature that an entrepreneur is taking on. That's an entrepreneurial risk. So that's one way to conceive of that point as well, that there's like there is a factor there.
Yeah, and the other thing I would say is that this whole sort of sticky wages argument, it's really sneaky in a way. You know, it's you're in a way taxing people by creating the new money. People don't notice because some people won't notice, that's for sure. And there's people, you know, on fixed incomes, if they're on a if they're out of a job or something like that, or if they're on a
Yeah.
pension, or and then
I'll tell you one thing that's
they
really hidden
might
there.
not notice. So in a way, the sticky wages psychological argument is kind of right, but then it's just nasty. Like you're
Yeah, well,
stealing from.
it's a corollary, right, of what happens. And one really like nasty effect is inflation plus capital gains is like a wealth tax. And you might have seen recently today, Jesse Powell was talking about this as well, because he was making the point, which is true, which is that because of capital gains taxes, if you bought something at a certain price and it has risen in nominal price, but not in real price, when you sell that asset, you technically have a capital gain. And now you've got to pay that difference. And so in a lot of countries around the world, there's a capital gains tax. Here in Australia, we have it. USA have it. Basically, most countries have it. And it is basically like a wealth tax. It's like a way of trying to subtly chip away at your accumulated wealth. Because
Yes.
whenever you sell a property, you're going to be basically, you might think, oh yeah, I made $300,000 on this property or whatever. But really, a lot of that is inflation and you're paying tax on that. So it's just kind of like a easy way for the government to just kind of clip the ticket. And again, I mean, a lot of this stuff is what Bitcoin is going to change eventually. Like if enough people get into it, which I think will.
Well, hang on.
Then
You just
change.
mentioned that if your estate goes up in value, that's a form of inflation. That's the other nasty thing, that is not counted in the inflation statistics. The value
Oh,
of
of course. Yeah.
so
Yeah, because that's CPI, consumer price inflation. Whereas what's
exactly.
happening nowadays is like asset inflation in the stocks and in the property and in all, and whatever else.
So why? Because I actually want to ask this as well. Why aren't we seeing as much inflation in the CPI?
For now, it hasn't shown up because for now, most of it has gone into the assets.
Mm-hmm.
But eventually, it will come into the consumer prices as well, right? So
So why
you
hasn't that
hear.
happened yet?
I guess I don't really have a good answer, to be honest. I think that's kind of like the $6 million question, right? I think this is one of those things where like really top level macro guys will kind of try to think about how it's going to play out and things. I don't pretend to be smart enough to know, but I guess some of the fact, like if you just kind of want a bit of a sketch of what to think about here, you have to think about what is the rate of new money creation, typically by loans, But then you've also got to think about what's the rate of money destruction, right? If loans are getting paid off, if we're seeing credit collapse happening. And then, you kind of weigh in some of these other little ideas, like say shrinkflation, right? Like you might buy, a bag of chips, but actually you're getting less chips than you did 5 years ago in the bag of chips, like things like that. And then it's difficult to tease it all out because at the same time, we've got technology like driving the cost down in some things, right? So for example, you can learn online with Skillshare and whatever else, these websites, much cheaper than you could before. And
Yeah.
the credentialing required in the past, like, yeah, there's still some credentialing going on, but a lot of top level employers don't care that much about whether you went to university anymore. Whereas in the past, that was very much a thing. Whereas now people can just sort of prove their skill online. And if they built a brand and a name for themselves in their niche, then that is way more valuable than just having a university degree.
Well, the thing you just mentioned is probably what I would think is we must, as humanity, get much better at producing everything. Like we're getting more efficient. We're getting, we're stacking up capital, automation. Like everything is getting cheaper, easier, etc. So if we don't see a change in prices, that actually is a form of inflation because we should see prices go down over time, right? So if we don't see a change in prices, that's what inflation, that means there's inflation.
Yes, that's right. And so it's like we don't really even have a good baseline because zero is not exactly the baseline. We should actually be seeing benefits if we were really, like, if everything was getting counted correctly. So it's almost like a tip of the iceberg sort of scenario where there actually are a lot of benefits over time, like because we're getting better at producing this, that, and the other. But we're not, you and I, the average consumer, are not seeing that because it is, again, the Cantillon effect.
So who is seeing the benefits then? The benefits must be going somewhere, Stefan.
So the benefits go to the person who receives the new money first. And so oftentimes that's the government. And the benefit, like in a theoretical sense, they go to the person who gets the new credit. They get to spend the new money before the price effect has rippled out to everyone and someone else's salary has gone up. So for example, now it's hard to say, but typically a lot of, property development companies are using leverage. They're using credit. Governments using leverage, using credit. If you work in banking and financial services, typically you would have a higher salary because your industry is earning more because, again, you are closest to the monetary spigot. So that is the way I would summarize that in a way. So
I guess generally what you mentioned before, in a system like this, those who benefit most are those that get themselves into most debt the soonest.
Yes. And so because of the leverage effect, you can just, and I guess, you and I know, like in the Bitcoin world, we know this on, people getting wrecked on BitMEX with leverage, but ultimately people can take less leverage, right? And that's known as the carry trade, right? So people are doing, like, they would borrow in one currency, to do these kinds of operations and multiply their profits. And so that's also where you see some of these people blow up because, again, it's like BitMEX wrecked, right? So, but ultimately it makes it so much more kind of easy to take these kind of speculative risks in a way where you're not really feeling the risk, the downside risk. And so, that's kind of what we've encouraged for the last 50 years, let's call it, since 1971, right? So obviously the effect has mostly been in the US, but it happens in other countries as well, right? Like we see it here in Australia. It's funny because the way I like this joke, which is basically it's not saying that all of a sudden, now that we've got cheap credit, entrepreneurs just become idiots, right? So it's not that entrepreneurs become idiots, it's that idiots become entrepreneurs, right? So it's like, you hear these stories and you've probably seen similar, but here in Australia, one of the property search engine websites called domain.com.au, right? And often they would run like little news articles on there. Now, not so much nowadays, but a couple of years ago, it was very common where they would show these stories of, oh, look, this 28-year-old, he's got 30 properties, and look, he's been saving up since 18 and got his first property at 21, and now he's like, leave it up till he's like, till his eyeballs in debt. And oh, look, isn't he an amazing, while all you people, you're 28 and you're struggling to get your first home or whatever, right? That's the typical story, right? Or you go to a barbecue in Australia and it would be all about, oh, what property did you buy? Oh yeah, I bought in this suburb and I bought in this whatever. And like, that's because that's the culture of it. And I think it's funny enough because some of my listeners, they tell me they're from different countries and they've got the same phenomenon happening in their country, right? Like I have listeners from, South Africa tell me they had the same thing there. And it's just everywhere.
Yeah, we don't have the barbecues that much over here. I should come over to Australia one day, and we'll go to a barbecue, Stefan.
Yeah, for sure.
So over the past 50 years, this is what I was getting at earlier, and you just mentioned it. We've kind of been stumbling from crisis to crisis, and it's not just the politicians that have been thinking on a short-term manner, but even also central bankers. So instead of letting a crisis play out, so they start with the dot-com bubble, that was sort of papered over with the housing crisis. And then instead of letting that happen, it was papered over. Is that the right term? Papered over? Anyways,
Yeah.
You know what I mean. Papered over with the everything bubble. So now we're at this point where we've been stacking up debt for 30 years and just pushing kicking the can down the road, like you said. Now we have this virus, and, my opinion is, by the way, even if bars would open, they'd still be in trouble. Like if they would be allowed to open, because a lot of people just don't want to go to a bar now because they don't want to die or infect others. So it's a problem either way, regardless of what the government does. So we've been kicking this can for all this time, and now the economic situation is looking pretty bad. How are they going to be able to kick it again, Stefan? Or what's going to happen now?
This is probably more like a macro question. I wouldn't say I'm a particularly big macro thinker or whatever.
Neither am I.
My guess though is that they will try. Right, they're gonna try. They're gonna try to print. They're gonna try to keep things going. Right, they'll do whatever they can to keep the house of cards running. Whether they will be successful, that's a tougher question. But I think we will go the way of Japan, right? It's going to be like a Japanification of the world, right? So that's been the thesis. That's been the play, if you will. So what happened in Japan in the late 80s, right? So they had a massive run up. They had a huge, huge bubble. And then people who bought at the top in the late 80s in Japan, I think they're still not whole. Oh, I think they have been whole if you count dividends, but they're not in terms of just like the straight stock price, right? And so they created a zombie economy. They basically made all these companies that just that weren't really that long-term sustainable, but they were just kind of living on the cheap credit. And, the Japanese government started buying a lot of bonds. So maybe we see a similar phenomenon where central banks around the world start doing that, or they start buying stocks, right? So I know the Swiss National Bank directly just buys stocks. Mm-hmm. Who knows how long it is until the Fed starts just directly buying stocks. So, it moves in stages, right? And I think it will eventually get to a point where people, they want things politically, and they just want it now, and they want it cheap. They don't want to save up and pay for it the proper way. So printing is the way it's going to go.
So would that even work, you think? And I'll explain why I'm asking this. So of course, what's the term of the price? Hayek's like the Austrian price mechanism. Like you need prices as a sort of communication method within a communication mechanism within an economy. Now, if the central bank goes around just buying up everything, then that's obviously a huge price distortion. And I think it was Hayek or another prominent Austrian economist, who argued that the reason that the Soviet Union could sort of function for at least a while is because there was also a free world where prices were still allowed to be, found naturally. So then if there's a free world where you can sort of look at the prices, then the Soviet Union can still sort of manage.
They could sort of proxy off that. Yeah.
Yes, but if the whole world becomes a Soviet Union, then there's no proxy for price anymore. So if this Japanification could be a similar example. I mean, like it's sort of functioning because it's only Japan and the rest of the world is doing well. What if the whole world becomes like us? Would it still work?
That's a good question. And I'll tell you what, I don't know if anyone really has a good answer on that. Like, I think everyone's just kind of like, this is kind of going into an uncharted territory area, because I don't know if we've ever seen that. I think as Bitcoiners, though, we're all very bullish on Bitcoin, and we think obviously people should just start pricing things and using things in Bitcoin. That's a while off, but it's a gradually then suddenly thing, right? And I think it during this next I'll be presumptive. I'll say we are kind of hitting a bull run, and we're gonna in like a couple of years' time the price will be way higher than it is now,
Mm-hmm.
and that will that will vault Bitcoin into the next level, and then people will have to actually start taking it just that little bit more seriously, right? We'll probably have a crash though, right? It'll be just like the same. We've seen these 4-year cycles, so I think we'll probably see the same again, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, in terms of like people being able to properly price things, I think the other factor is to think about it like it's quasi nationalization of different companies, right? Because if the government starts to own the stock market, then it's kind of like a quasi nationalization. And
Well,
so,
exactly, yeah.
yeah. And so everything becomes politicized. And this is a point that Hans Hermann Hoppe makes as well, I think, in Theory of Socialism and Capitalism, which is a great book. Fantastic. So in that book, one of the theses I think he talks about there is that like as more things get politicized, you can't just like go to the sport and watch a game of sport, watch the sport without there also being some random political other thing that going on and so on. Like it's everything just becomes political, and so then there's no right, like from a more libertarian free market private property theory, you would say, well, when there's a conflict on a scarce resource, it's the property owner or the first person to who legitimately owned that should have exclusive control and decide what happens, right? That's the role of property rights, right? But when everything just becomes politicized, it sort of goes towards that thesis of more like, what maybe a good example. I think in the book he makes that example. Maybe this is from Democracy, the God That Failed, but basically he's making this point that if everyone in the world had a vote, even kids, then eventually it would be seen like, oh, there's a right to lollies and cookies, right? And that would be like taken seriously, like, oh yeah, you have a right to lollies and cookies, why not, right? Because everything just becomes this political football. So I think that's the phenomenon also to watch, but it takes time to get there, right? Like Japan has been doing that for like decades, right? I think it will take some time just for it to sort of properly become like a nationalized, government controlled everything. And in that meantime, we've got this opportunity right now and the next, let's call it 5-10 years, where we can build the Bitcoin parallel economy, right? People can really build out like their own alternatives, and we can hopefully make it so that people can have an easy thing to transition into. And so I think that's a really cool factor, and I'd love to help promote that. I mean, I do promote that kind of idea that, hey, you should build your own little parallel, you should run your own BTC Pay server, and you should try to build that little parallel economy. Obviously, though, it'll take some time, and there's a lot more hodling on the way as well. But I'm very excited by that idea because I think there's just so much potential there.
I agree, of course. There might also be a lot of pushback.
Of course.
If we look at we're now seeing comparisons with the crash of 29 and then the 30s, the depression. Now, of course, in the United States, to sort of get out of the depression, or at least that was the idea behind it, FDR installed the New Deal, and to do that, he basically had to ban gold. So the modern equivalent would be to ban Bitcoin. Do you think is this something you're concerned about, or do you think this is something that could happen? Or
it's a possibility, but I don't put too much stock into that. I think it might happen in some countries, but not in all of them. And I think it's one of those things where as soon as like one country tries to ban it, then maybe some other country will have an incentive to allow it and try to benefit from it and profit
Hmm.
from it, because hey, we need a way to actually price things. And if all the fiat monies are slowly just devaluing over time, people will just kind of naturally go towards Bitcoin. And the other factor I see as well is rich Bitcoin people who just buy politicians, who just influence politicians to have beneficial Bitcoin policies. And so I see that as a factor. I also see potentially this idea of, well, Bitcoin citadels, free private cities, whatever you want to call it, right? Like people might over time set up a bunch of these all around the world, right? Not just one, and set up their own little private cities, private security, private whatever. And then let's say that government starts to collapse, but this private city is going fine on its own, then it kind of starts its own little thing, and then it just becomes its own little refuge. And you build up enough of those, and maybe we end up with a world where it is just lots of Singapores and Hong Kongs and Switzerlands and Liechtensteins and Monacos and whatever else. That's a sort of, to my mind, that's a sort of plausible outcome, but like longer term, um, it'll take some time. And hopefully we see some more secession as well, right? So we saw some potential moves towards secession in the US with some of these states saying we'll try and form up into our own little sub units to deal with corona.
Hmm.
And so
The EU is
maybe,
falling apart as well.
yeah, right. And so I would love to see the EU fall apart and become more like, you know, independent small city state nations. And then this would be so much more amenable to the idea of everyone just setting up their own little Bitcoin citadels and whatever. And then, you know, I think these cities would operate in a more upfront way, right? Instead of like this whole you join and, you know, it's like the Star Wars Darth Vader thing. It's like, pray I do not alter the deal any further, right? Because you when you're in the country, you don't get a choice. You don't really have a choice, right? Because if everyone else votes for more government, well, you guess what? You get more government and you pay more tax. Whereas in this free private city model, it's upfront. You agree. This is how much I'm paying. I'm paying $1,200 a year for the minimal services, and the rest I pay for all myself. And then it'll just be so much more prosperous, so much wealthier, I think, and it would just have so much more opportunity as well. You know, and you know, the other thing is, even before we get to the whole Bitcoin Citadel idea, this whole idea of people just doing it from where they are, you know, being like setting up online as an entrepreneur. They could even set up as a pseudonym, right? For all we know, who knows? And just sell whatever their products and services are online and just start in a digital way, right? We can have our little digital citadels until we accumulate enough capital and wealth and enough, you know, hardcore Bitcoin people to actually go and make Bitcoin citadels a reality.
Hmm. Okay, so last question, and we started this conversation about Austrian economics, and so one of the things I really like about Austrian economics is just the approach to the whole domain. So instead of, I think Bob Murphy's, who I mentioned earlier, his um, how he explained it is in geometry, yeah, in geometry. If you want to,
Geometry, yep.
yeah, if you want to prove that a triangle has, you know, must add up to, what is it, 180 degrees?
The
Maybe.
A squared plus B squared equals C squared or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. That if you want to prove that, you don't go around finding triangles in the world and sort of measure them. No, you reason it by yourself, like it must be true, and that's sort of the approach that Austrians have, which I think is very interesting. Now, over the past 50 years, of course, we have had sort of Keynesian and then the sort of monetarist paradigm. Is this gonna come to an end if the whole economy crashes? Are we finally gonna get rid of this, and is Austrian economics gonna make an actual influence on the world, Stefan?
I hope so. But I'll tell you what, the number of people who were into Austrian economics before they got into Bitcoin is very small.
Mm-hmm.
What we're finding is actually the other way around. It's that people get into Bitcoin and then they read, you know, the Bitcoin Standard, or they start listening to my podcast, and then they start coming down that Austrian rabbit hole as well. And so I think it's a funny kind of thing that because Bitcoin is already this hard money and it kind of goes towards this idea of showing you that you really can have a bottom up money, it's forcing people to rethink a lot of other things. And then in that process, they sort of come to the more intellectual understanding of it. And as you mentioned, like as Bob Murphy teaches, or as Hans Hermann Hoppe writes in Economic Science and the Austrian Method, the method just makes so much more sense to me. And so that's one of those things, like even for me as a kid, when I was reading some of these Austrian economics articles, it just made sense, but I didn't understand why. And I think at that point I was a kid, I hadn't quite thought through, but it just kind of intuitively made sense. I just couldn't put my finger on it. And then later, obviously, after reading Human Action and, watching Bob Murphy talks and listening and reading these books, it sort of came to me more, and I understood a little bit more around, the value of deductive reasoning and this idea of a synthetic a priori truth. And so those are all things that, just kind of appealed to me. And so, look, here's the thing, right? I think, and this is why we joke about some of these things like, number go up or whatever, right? Because not everybody is going to be a quote unquote 1,000-page Austrian, right? They're not going to go and read Human Action and Man, Economy and State and Money, Bank Credit and Economic Cycles, but they can just intuitively grasp a lot of these things. And I think that is the way this actually plays out, is that a lot of people just intuitively will come into the Bitcoin world. They'll intuitively grasp the idea of hodling, and then they'll just kind of naturally be into it. And here's the thing, you don't necessarily have to go and read all this Austrian economic stuff. Like it, like for me, obviously I like it. I'm interested in it, and a lot of Bitcoin people are interested in it. But for some people, it doesn't matter. They just be a part of the Bitcoin economy, and it won't matter to them. And so I think the reason, and here's the other thing, let's bring it back to why, how did all this Keynesian and monetarist stuff get so popular in the first place? Remember who funds all this, right? So it's not like some deep, dark conspiracy. It's just that where are a lot of the economists' jobs? They're in a central bank. Which central bank is going to have Austrian economists there? That's not how it works. So a lot of the government-funded enterprises, like the universities and the central banks, are obviously going to, be more in that direction of having intellectuals who provide the intellectual cover fire for more government. And that is why universities just became this very progressive and interventionist or statist places, because again, that's just the environment that breeds. So I think Bitcoin is its own environment, and Bitcoin will bring about more of a economically appropriate and kind of just a more like it like, and if you kind of look at it and if you reason it out, I think it really does come to a more free market view of the world. And whether and look, not everyone has to be an Austrian to be into Bitcoin, to be fair, right? I mean,
No,
for all we know,
you just gotta care about your own wealth, basically.
yeah, right. And the way to, because here's the thing, right? It's not that Satoshi was an Austrian, right? We don't know that. He might well have just been, some guy trying to make a technology for something that he wanted at that time, maybe, who knows? And it's kind of just more like a bunch of us later came and sort of realized the value of it from an Austrian perspective. Now, in fairness, though, Hal Finney has referenced some Austrians in some of his earlier forum posts and things.
The extropians were all over Austrian economics, and the cypherpunks as well, or at least extropians, pretty much all of them, and then some of the extropians sort of went on to form the cypherpunks. So there's definitely, like, if you see Satoshi as someone who came from the cypherpunk background, then there's definitely a heritage from sort of Austrian economics that led to Bitcoin.
Yeah, exactly. Or someone like, say, Tim May, who was an influence on Nick Szabo, right? So again, there's all these kind of influences between the two. So you can sort of see that. But even, let's say, hypothetically, even if they weren't Austrian, it might not have mattered in the end, right? They might have just made this technology, and it just kind of, we could assess why it worked after the fact and understand, from this perspective, actually, you don't need an inflating money supply, but it just happened to work that way. But in fairness, though, it might also be that part of the reason Bitcoin got so big is because of that fixed supply as well. So yeah, it depends how you think about it.
Absolutely. All right. I think we're pushing about an hour, which is sort of the max I want my podcast to be, more or less. I thought this was very interesting. So thanks for being on, Stefan.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Aaron.
And stay safe.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye.